Well, good evening and welcome to select audience. I think somewhere else there is a debate on Kashmir happening that may have sort of distracted people. But I know there are people who join us online and watch this on YouTube as well. So I'm delighted to welcome Nausheen and Anwar to Wolfson College to give our annual Sarfraz lecture. The Sarfraz lectures look at global issues, as you know, often from the perspective of those living in the developing world. And we're always grateful to Lord Sarfraz, who generously supports this series of lectures. Dr. Anwar is many things, but she's an urban planner from Pakistan. If urban planning is her starting point, she takes the experience of large cities and explores through them climate change, violence, security, gender, social inequality. Any of you who've lived in or visited large cities in the global south will know the challenges they face, the challenges they pose. They do provide jobs and opportunities and innovation, but they also create threats. Floods expose the vulnerability of urban low-income neighbourhoods. COVID-19 revealed the precarious existence of 1.6 billion informal workers around the world, often attracted to the opportunities big cities offer. From Sao Paulo to Nairobi to Karachi, these great cities of the global south merit research and discussion. Dr. Anwar is Professor of City and Regional Planning at the Institute of Business Administration in Karachi, a Fellow of the Institute of Development Studies in the Cities Cluster, and she is founder and director of the Karachi Urban Lab, an interdisciplinary and collaborative platform studying the challenges of urbanization. And she will tonight talk to us about heatscapes and cooling futures in urban Pakistan.
Okay, let me first begin by thanking Sir Tim for that very generous and very kind introduction. And I would also like to thank Nikita, who I believe is the one who recommended my name for the Sarfraz lecture for this year, and everyone else who's in the audience today and online for joining, whether it's today or down the road, because this will be recorded. So thank you for giving me an opportunity to talk about what are a set of ideas essentially on overheating and cooling in the context of Karachi and another city that I'm working on in Pakistan for a very, very preliminary book project. So these are a set of ideas that I presented recently at York University in Toronto, Canada. So this is my second opportunity in which I have developed things a tiny bit more, but certainly not enough for a full-fledged book project. But I appreciate your patience and then the Q&As that will follow hopefully after this. So extreme heat in South Asia has become pervasive due to climate change, and vulnerable populations must manage the risk of thermal harm. These risks include not only the acute heat waves, but also the chronic effects of sustained heat exposure, as the laboring body absorbs the complex mediation of sunlight and other forms of radiant emissions. Physiologists demonstrate that even though humans have their own thermoregulatory processes, these are being impacted by unprecedented and extreme weather changes. Within the last 2 decades, Pakistan has experienced over 152 adverse climatic events comprising floods, storms, heat waves, and droughts. Certain studies based on the global circulation models project that in Pakistan, average temperatures will increase 2.8 Celsius by the 2050s and 3.9 to 4.4 Celsius by the 2080s. From a historical perspective, the overall temperature in Pakistan has already risen by an average of 0.6 Celsius, according to certain studies. A significant change is the increased frequency of days with intense heat, a 5-fold increase in heatwave days per annum. And Pakistan's southern province of Sindh is understood as one of South Asia's hotspots for climate change. And its largest city, Karachi, and even secondary cities such as Jacobabad, where I will be starting a new project alongside a climate scientist, in a new collaboration, which is actually a project that we've won together, Dr. Tom Matthews at King's College London. But I will not be talking so much about Jacobabad today, but mostly about Karachi. But Jacobabad, nevertheless, which is approximately an 8.5-hour drive from Karachi in the sort of northeastern part of Sindh, has become the poster child for what is known as one of the hottest cities on the planet, certainly in South Asia. So even secondary cities such as Jacobabad have become a focal point for planners, policymakers, and NGOs in matters of heat governance. From March to April 2022, a prolonged cycle of heat waves triggered searing temperatures over 45 Celsius across cities in Pakistan. During the 2015 heat wave, which is considered the 5th deadliest recorded in global history across parts of South Asia, over 1,200 people died in Karachi alone. Deadly heat waves and chronic heat with its stealth-like effects on the human body have become commonplace across urban Sindh and generally across South Asia. In my ongoing research on heat and urban life in Karachi and in Jacobabad, I look at the mundane context in which heat is experienced and talked about, and explore its effects on urban imaginations, experiences, and emotions. With an official population of 21 million, Karachi is a teeming city located along the Arabian Sea. It is situated at a low altitude with a hot, arid subtropical climate and an abundance of high-density, high-rise buildings, as well as urban sprawl, interspersed with asphalt, concrete, and limited green vegetation. Informal settlements make up nearly 65% of the city's dense housing. The city's residents have long battled high temperatures, water shortages, and alongside this, varying degrees of thermal discomfort. In the daytime, the average ambient temperature averages around 35 Celsius, although feels-like temperatures, which often take account of humidity, can be considerably higher. Even a cursory glance at the casualties of the 2015 heat wave suggests that a thermal penalty on certain citizens is in fact being imposed, a penalty that exemplifies the ground zero of social vulnerabilities and the socioeconomic and spatial patterns of injustice that underwrite the lives of ordinary citizens in cities like Karachi. Given the locations where people died and where bodies were recovered, the people represented by that statistic were killed by heat exposure. But these numbers represent only those bodies that were reported or died during or in the immediate aftermath of the heat wave. So heat, in the ways individuals experience it, adapt to it, and work around it, and the impacts it has on their daily routines, thus forms an essential component of daily rhythms and negotiations across different kinds of urban spaces. However, I don't approach Karachi as the scene of an unfolding dystopia, but my research deals with the following questions and a series of sub-questions that will come up later. How does heat relate to the daily lives of people? How does it contribute to the production of new ideas about urban life in a major Pakistani city? And relatedly on cooling, what forms of new rulemaking are impacting people's mode of inhabitation and circulations of air? Today, I offer preliminary insights from ongoing ethnographic and survey research for a developing book project. My fieldwork in Karachi has focused on how people make sense of their urban life worlds, yet do so with heat as a recurrent theme, shedding light on various understandings about a variety of uses, ideas, and/or meanings. But I do acknowledge the core assumption that heat has become a significant experience of the 21st century, an era presented as increasingly hot, crowded, unequal, full of thermal violence, and hence overheating. I understand thermal violence as a process that alters the body's capacity to thermoregulate, perhaps even a slow form of violence, and I take a cue here from Rob Nixon's work. At times, heat most certainly kills, but it also diminishes life. While death is a particular moment in time which marks the end of life, this is certainly how we can at times approach the impacts of heat. Yet at times, the impact of rising heat is more diffused in bodies and time. It may increase mortality, be related to other diseases and illnesses, cardiovascular or kidney failure, and that raises important legal and governance matters of responsibility, injury, risk, and harm. But amidst this violence, where the city may have become a sweatbox, and I take a cue here from Straloselski's work on the notion of the wet sweatbox on plantations in the United States at the turn of the last century, I also understand overheating as a concept borrowed from the anthropologist Thomas Erickson, who refers to the outcome of runaway change that is the unintended consequence of late modernity. In Erickson's approach, overheating offers us a new perspective on energy use, urbanization, human mobility, immobility, and the spread of technology. It takes a cue from Claude Lévi-Strauss's idea of a world full of interconnected people and projects. I would like to be able to play with this idea and thinking about heat to see where it takes me conceptually and empirically. As rising temperatures become a global concern, it is more than ever relevant to study the significance of heat in everyday life. We need to understand how people navigate, govern, inhabit, and metabolize heat, and demonstrate new forms of agency and develop new bodies to cope with everyday life under hotter conditions. Heat is linked to practices. It is embedded, and people have historically always related to heat, especially in South Asia. And there are gendered and intersectional dimensions to heat in terms of material, the social, and the cognitive. So I want to talk about urban heat and cooling today through three lenses: infrastructure, inhabitation, and the archive. In thinking about inhabitation, I take a cue from certain urban scholars who talk about urban worlds in the 21st century as increasingly complex places and what inhabiting them means for ordinary people to get things done in dissonant times. Inhabitation references the sense of dwelling in a place, and in that act, being at home or making a home in the world, in an infrastructure of inhabitation where heating and cooling necessitate new thresholds of knowledge, of learning, of acting, and of the body itself persevering in a context where heat permeates through all the social and material qualities of homes, work, and lives. Heat is diffused within the built environment of cities like Karachi, and in many instances in places where cooling is diminished or not available. My fieldwork has initially focused on people's risk perceptions of heat in relation to health, materials, livelihoods, and infrastructures. By this, I mean people from different socioeconomic backgrounds inhabiting various types of dwellings, homes across the city, as well as those involved in informal livelihoods. I have also been talking to healthcare professionals, architects, and state officials at various levels of government. Before I proceed to share with you a couple of slices of the archive, I'm not a historian, so bear with me. I was talking to Nikita today about the challenges of doing archival work. And before I also share with you some vignettes from a series of thermal diaries that my colleagues and I produced in 2022, I would like to give you an overview of the surveys that we undertook across the city, especially in terms of locations and methods and so forth. So we did a very extensive survey, so we were very lucky. We had a lot of money. This was funded by the ESRC in a project called Cooling Infrastructures, Life with Heat in the Off-Grid City. We were working with colleagues across the United Kingdom, in Jakarta and Indonesia, in India and Hyderabad with the Hyderabad Urban Lab and with Hyderabad Institute of Technology, as well as colleagues over in Cameroon. And we were all looking at these interconnections between heat and cooling and placing this notion of the off-grid city at the center of understanding what extreme heat and its impacts look like today. So we conducted a preliminary data from an extensive, we have preliminary data from an extensive survey of fieldwork that we conducted over the summer of 2022, which has yielded 13,000 surveys across 50 plus low-income or informal settlements and 3,000 plus surveys of informal workers. This has also included 30 in-depth interviews, myriad focus group discussions, alongside the usage of heat measurement equipment that we brought from overseas, that we ordered from overseas to help us to understand what it means to live with heat. Because to live with heat isn't just about heat waves and chronic heat, but also about the environment itself as it gets heated due to different kinds of heat emissions. And in the process, our objective was to assess risk perceptions, to understand grounded experiences of thermal comfort or discomfort, its intersections of embedded knowledges and applications, the usage, prevalence, and improvisations within heat management practices, and the innovative interchanges and trade-offs taking place at different sites. So we worked across Karachi's different districts, almost 7 districts, and in 57 different neighborhoods, which included low-income settlements, as well as middle to low to middle income. So different kinds of dwellings, which were ranging from jhuggies to kachi abadis to mid-rises to high-rises. And our intention was essentially to understand what people's experiences of extreme heat were in relation to the different kinds of materialities and built environments that they were inhabiting in that moment. So one of the interesting things that we found was that 1/5 of all the respondents spent 24 hours inside the home. And of these, 77% are essentially women. This was across the household surveys. So there are consequent thermal harm to bodies that is gendered, spatial, as well as embodied. And the equipment that we were using was also sort of helping us to understand that when we look at people's rhythms in terms of work during the day at different times of the day, from the morning to the afternoon to the evenings, within the home and outside the home, what is the equipment telling us in terms of different kinds of heat emissions in the kitchen, in the bedroom, and so forth? And how are people then managing their daily rhythms in terms of these different locations, experiences, and exposure to extreme heat? Okay. So, however, as I have learned, that survey work and ethnographic work especially is fundamentally messy. And I am inspired by the on-ground experiences and concerns of diverse interlocutors. And this has become evident to me in the course of this work, that an analysis of urban life in Karachi in terms of heating and cooling needs a broader scope. So, premised on scholarly attention to the promises of infrastructure, and I'm thinking here of Brian Larkin's work, I am interested in unpacking how the promise of a better future is taking shape, how the relations this entails are being negotiated, and how the failure and or success of their terms might be leading to the ruination as well as the celebration of a not yet materialized future. So related to this, I ask, what is the emerging state of rule setting around different forms of inhabitation that may or may not subject people to new codes about ventilation or cooling? Where and how is the air flowing? How is the state itself reaching into certain spaces with a new rulemaking? And by this I refer to codes or regulations that might be reconfiguring where and how cool air flows. And there is an old colonial story embedded in this also. And in this, then, I also take a cue from Henri Lefebvre's foundational work on rhythm analysis, which presents how rhythm is constitutive of the repeated practices and activities at specific times. It thus addresses various aspects of social life involving lived spaces and the environment alongside the relationship of individuals with said spaces. And certain scholars, such as Gordon Walker and Elspeth Opperman, have deployed the concept rhythm analysis to explore heat and heat stress through its role in the routine cycles of daily life, as rhythm analysis provides a lens through which time and space can be visualized in tandem. Rhythm analysis is a method through which the nuances and intricacies of daily life can be understood and analyzed. It allows for engagement with the multidimensional and extensive relationship of Karachi's residents and heat. How might we move to a rhythm analysis of the South Asian city? So the successes and failures of these rhythms, movements, and negotiations are unfolding against a backdrop of state-led actions to establish greener and more affordable energy futures for Pakistan. Critical infrastructure, affordable energy futures that are also coal-fired, a fossil fuel-fed thermal comfort for many. Mastering heat, then, in an everyday sense, is deeply implicated in narrative about Pakistan's ambition to be granted the status of energy self-sufficiency and to facilitate the thermal comfort of its citizens. Heat, then, and even cooling appear here as a material substance to be mastered in order to produce more viable urban futures. How might we interpret urban heat? This can be interpreted in terms of men and women navigating at various scales, from the home to the neighborhood, to the broader city, in maintaining livelihoods and searching for new ones. I also include here health practitioners trying to master the discourse of heat, corporeal perceptions and understandings of moving about within the home, lanes, neighborhood, entail dealing with the city's heated contexts, its contingencies and challenges. Under certain circumstances, this can lead to profound feelings of extreme overheating or bodily wasting caused by the city, perhaps a metabolic disruption. Elsewhere in Karachi's old, dense commercial area, Sadr, Female street vendors have installed umbrellas to shield themselves from the heat and the sun's glare. They sit on small plastic stools that offer some protection against the heat emitting from the concrete footpaths. And even in winter, when we carried out one particular aspect of the survey, the long hot days take a toll on the women's bodies. It is not uncommon for them to fall ill due to the intense and hazardous thresholds of bodily capacities that are constantly pushed to their thermal physiological tolerance limits. Across town, in neighborhood lanes, on roadsides and parking lots, under bridges and median trees, outdoor workers try to pass time in whatever forms of shade. Is shade an infrastructure? Can we think about shade as a part of this broader discourse on critical infrastructures? Searching for shade in terms of whatever they can find, a perpetual quest to seek protection from extreme heat and other forms of radiant emissions emanating from the built environment and from the rising temperatures due to global warming and intensifying heat islands. But finding shade and holding on to it has become risky business in cities like Karachi, where outdoor workers must negotiate shade policing and where green cover in the forms of trees and cooling spaces such as parks and local communal spaces have diminished considerably over the past 20, 30 years. This is tied to a very complex story of urban renewal and development in the 21st century. So let me move very briefly to the topic of heat and cooling as it sort of comes through in the historical colonial archive. So when I think of the topic of heating and cooling, this opens up an archive. Another way of thinking about this is how does heat or the thermal become an archive? How do we need to think about reading archives of all kinds in the pursuit of understanding heat? Part of this arises from the historical fact that infrastructures of heating and cooling and the uneven distribution of thermal comfort are intimately bound up with colonialism and empire. While hill stations built for the comfort of colonial officials and their kin is one of the most obvious examples, there were many other ways of conceptualizing entire regions through ideas of the climate. So along with my RA at the Karachi Urban Lab, Ali Samo, we have been rummaging through the many uncatalogued archival repositories across Pakistan and the UK. And we have come across some very interesting material that informs the extent of some parts of my talk today. So using correspondences, official administrative reports, and official gazettes as our primary source materials, we did a deep dive into an uncharted territory within the scope of archival research, navigating questions of heat in relation to the built environment of colonial Karachi, and the role the colonial officers had to play in orienting, supplanting, and understanding of heat within the bodies that inhabited the city. So as the work of colleagues, scholars such as Chatwi Chang over at National University Singapore has shown, the tropics were part of a colonial imaginary in which particular places like India were placed in a racialized global hierarchy of places and people. The tropics were a geographic and climatic zone that spanned the circumference of the earth, producing differentiated kinds of bodies and persons, diseases and illnesses, and ideas of nature and humans. In the case of Punjab and Sindh, for instance, discourses of semi-arid or arid and hot and sweaty climates were directly part of colonial interventions into agriculture, specifically the building of the system of canals to open agricultural land and increasing agrarian production. Here too, climatic imaginaries are caught up with multiple kinds of infrastructural interventions into ecologies of the urban. And I am thinking here about the building of cantonments in cities like Karachi, their placement in relation to the airflows and in relation to the native city or native bodies. In the context of Pakistan and much of South Asia, climatic discourses have become increasingly salient in political life, not only for rising heat, but also changes in the monsoon and flooding. They have been and are continuing to enter into the domains of law and governance, as well as social movements concerned with the environment. And it seems that thinking about heat as an archive first opens unexpected histories of colonialism and imperialism that subsequently might unpack contemporary discourses on global warming in novel ways. So my foray into the archive, a very, very novice, a very, very, for the historians who are present here today, be kind with me, brings up some interesting stories about colonial officers making their way through Sindh and specifically Karachi in the mid-1800s and early 1900s. In an official correspondence sent to the commissioner in Sindh in August 1906 by H.C. Mules Esquire, the then collector of Karachi, a request for a district bungalow at Laki was put in. Laki, modern-day Laki Hills, was a small town in Sindh located south of the Manchar Lake, connected to the larger Kirtar mountain range, and was part of the Karachi district in the early 20th century. It was, quote, an important railway station and one of the larger villages of the Manjhand Mahal, end quote, where district officers were to frequently encamp. During hot weather, the deputy collector and subdivisional magistrate were to halt at the place on at least 2 occasions. However, there was no suitable housing where officials could reside. So in the correspondence, particular emphasis is paid to the fact that, quote, living in tents during the summer is out of the question, end quote. So much so that the, quote, heat which issues from the sandstone rocks is unbearable and is considered to be without parallel in any other place in the province, end quote. The Musafir Khana, presently situated, was an old, miserable structure, without doors, exposing it to, quote, intense blasts of heat, end quote, fit only for habitation by, quote, wandering fakirs, etc., end quote. The one other place is the railway waiting room, but that is, quote, anything but comfortable, end quote, and there are no, quote, quarters for servants, end quote. And so magisterial work could not possibly conducted at such a place. Historicizing this brief correspondence not only lays bare the social, political, and epistemological constructions of the colonial government and its perceptions of heat, but also practices of inscription and subject making. Building a bungalow at Lucky is not merely a project that sustains or facilitates colonial encampment, but also produces a native extension of a subordinate class. The natives, too, are divided along the lines of a darvish and the servant, requiring 2 distinct forms of habitations, a Musafir Khana and a servant's quarter. A hierarchy of colonial class is projected into this project. The bungalow is not made for the soldiers, but for the subdivisional magistrate and the collector, now that access to the area through railway has been secured. And at the same time, the servants are not put under the same larger category of the darvish, but rather outside of the realms of the Musafir Khana, that is within the colonial infrastructural sphere, but downgraded to the servants' quarters. So perhaps a closer reading of this correspondence is also telling us of the way in which the servant is positioned outside of the native nomadic category and placed somewhere between the darvish and the European, between the uncivil and the civil. At another instance, an article published in the Civil and Military Gazette narrated an English traveller's agonies and pleasures of living in a bungalow in Sadr with, quote, congregations of flies that are incomparable in any other location, end quote. And then moving southwards along the Clifton Beach, which is stated in the correspondence as in the traveller's story as comparable to Brighton in the United Kingdom, owing to the heat and the unclean state, comparable to Brighton, and assumes a loitering tendency of the native servants who are to facilitate the Englishmen owing to the heat and unclean state of the region. While he praises the beach, Clifton Beach, his brief comment on the servants also unravels a colonial presumption of moral superiority. Clifton being described as the Brighton of Karachi, whereas the amounts of flies in main Sadr town determined the ill health of the estate, linking it to the servants who loiter around, assuming their degenerateness based off of a geography distance within single unit miles. Moreover, local knowledges and practices by this time were looked not so much as facilitating feature of daily existence, but rather as poor and underdeveloped, uncivilized acts owing to climate variation. So Clifton Beach today actually is one of the most elite parts of Karachi, and it is largely where a lot of the super expensive real estate in Karachi is also concentrated, along with other parts of the city. So the archive is full of complaints of actively anxious white bodies unable to cope with the heat, where the climate is an issue, a point in question. This is an anxiety that we can see transferring perhaps to the middle class urban populations today, much like everything else colonial. Even the ideas of weather for us, our reception to the climate, form a colonial conceptualization. Perhaps it might be prudent then to ask, where do these anxieties persist in the present moment? When I think about splintered inhabitations, I don't have a clear-cut answer for this yet. So let me move now to everyday inhabitations and negotiating heat, and some vignettes from the thermal diaries that my colleagues and I at the Karachi Urban Lab undertook in 2022. So I present 3 vignettes. The first is Fisherman Musa. Fisherman Musa lives in Malwari Para in Ibrahim Hedri, which faces the Arabian Sea. He lives with his 4 family members in a house that is 31 by 33 feet. He earns rupees 600 per day. The home is made of concrete blocks with an old Panaflex attached to provide shade. The 2 main rooms have an attached bathroom. There are ceiling fans and ventilating windows. The rooms are 13 by 13 feet each, separated by a 5-foot by 13-foot bathroom. There is also a tiny veranda, which you can see in these photographs. The space off the veranda is occupied by a kitchen, an outdoor store, and a latrine, and an open space covered by a large tree. Drinking water is stored in a large-size water drum. The family pays rupees 100 per day for water. Electricity load shedding lasts for 10 to 12 hours per day. Musa works from 2 p.m. to 8 a.m. and the fishing season lasts from August to May, which are generally hot months, with December to February being relatively cooler. And Musa experiences peak heat hours between 12 p.m. to 4 p.m. For Musa, heat is understood through water politics, through varying catches of fish, and the changing patterns of rain. In Musa's neighborhood, heat navigation is a communal experience. Facing and coping with heat and poverty as a community, residents of Ibrahim Haidari work together to clear the way for a jetty where ships can be docked, repair work is done, and where they can all sit comfortably at an otak that the fisherfolk themselves have constructed. Spaces like the otak offer a way to deal with extreme heat. Community members often gather at the otak when electricity load shedding happens. As we move from Ibrahim Haidari into district Malir to Musa colony in a more central part of Karachi, we meet Huma, who is a beautician. Huma is 35 years old, and with her husband, 2 sons, and a daughter, she lives in a 60 square foot house on a busy market street. It has 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and a corridor with a kitchen at the end. Huma complains that her house gets hotter at night. There are a total of 3 ceiling fans installed in the house and a pedestal fan with batteries attached, so it can keep functioning when there is no electricity. The household used to rely on an air conditioner, but removed it because of high electricity bills. There is no public supply of water, so the family rely on tankers. Huma prefers to stay long hours in her beautician workspace because she says there are no electricity issues there. On hotter days, there is more work to be done because Huma makes specific kinds of food like khichdi. Heat does make her angrier, and she often lashes out at her customers when they bargain too much. She also fights with her husband. So she says, men feel hotter because aurat ko sabr ki taakat di hai. So for those who are not familiar with Urdu or Hindi, aurat ko sabr ki taakat di hai, meaning that God have naturally made women more patient. Men, she says, if they ever feel hot, can easily lash out. Aurat ki mitti zyada garam hoti hai. I really don't know how to translate that. That's a tough one. Aurat ki mitti zyada garam hoti hai. Huma attributes the overheated city to a growing population, diminishing trees and pollution. She says, Mother Earth is upset with us because of our sins. Har jagah keede pad rahe hain. The streets used to be densely lined with trees next to all the houses, but now you can't spot a single tree. Plots for a single family that used to have trees and a garden are now used to accommodate 16 families, causing more congestion, more heat, and there is no space for greenery anymore. On hot evenings, everyone would come out of their houses and line their charpais under the trees and relax, but there is no way to do that anymore. On hot days, Huma prefers to wear certain types of clothing to combat the heat. She doesn't wear black scarves because she says it's not good for the skin, but covering up makes her feel hotter, but she says that it's also important for haya, or modesty. Wearing a cap helps to protect against the sun. She eats salads and drinks lots of water and lassi to keep cool. She doesn't eat fish or paya in the summers, a noteworthy comment. The more we try to fight the heat, the more we will feel it, she says. She prefers wearing lawn shalwar kameez on hot days, and her sons and husband choose to not wear shirts at all when at home. She also tells us that living in an area with many buildings is good because it blocks the sunlight and heat, which is interesting because the conventional wisdom is that in high-density areas in cities or built-up areas, they are generally hotter. But this comment nevertheless contradicts her earlier statement that at night the house is getting hotter, but maybe that has something to do with the urban heat island effect and its effects in terms of heat not dissipating at night. And then there is also the issue of her overheated kitchen. So with this, let me move on to the third vignette, which is about Asma, who is a maid and an attendant at my university at IBA in Karachi. Asma is 40 years old and she keeps the bathrooms clean at IBA, which is a centrally air-conditioned campus sitting in Sadr, which is one of the oldest shopping districts, old districts in Karachi. However, workers like Asma are not allowed to sit inside the empty classrooms and offices to cool off. Asma is only allowed to sit in the spaces that are directly outside the bathroom. These spaces are not necessarily shaded and are exposed to heat in its many different forms. Like most of IB's cleaning staff, Asma has been hired on a contract through an external agency. She earns about 25,000 rupees a month. She works 8.5-hour shifts from 10 a.m. to 6:30 p.m. and she takes off on Sundays. She lives in Purana Golimar in District East. She lives with her husband, 2 sons and 2 daughters. She leaves for work at about 9:30 a.m. The distance from her home in Purana Golimar to IBA is about 10 minutes, but it takes her nearly half an hour to cover the distance due to traffic and walking and traveling in a Chinchi rickshaw and bus, which are part of a daily commute. Asma's flat is comprised of 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, and a kitchen, and is located on the 6th or top floor of a fairly dilapidated building. The only source of ventilation is a window and these little patches of little squares. She pays a rent of about 12,000 rupees per month. That doesn't include electricity and water. Typically, there are 7.5 hours of load shedding on a daily basis. And being on the top floor, the flat does get a lot hotter because of direct solar exposure, which hits the cement roof structure. And Asma complains of intense heated days and nights in her flat. But interestingly, she says that even her workspace at IBA is hot. She is mindful about her clothing. At home, she does find time to recuperate. But at IBA, there is constant ghutn. From 9 a.m. to 11 a.m. and then 12 p.m. to 3 p.m. These, she says, are the hottest parts of the day. Perhaps this is also because she finds the work environment is hostile and the male workers try to boss her. She says that the heat increases her anger, and when she comes home, she lashes out at her children. So I would now like to turn to this idea of new forms of rulemaking around cooling that I'm struggling to sort in my head and in my writing. And over here, I'm dealing largely with codes and regulations, new kinds of codes and regulations that are emerging in relation to the movement of cool air. So to what extent are these splintered inhabitations around heat being impacted by new modes of rule making about cooling? And I refer here to circulations of cool air that are remaking certain parts of the city. What kinds of cool airflows are being planned, and who are the recipients? In a very simple sense, middle class versus the slum dweller. How are interactions between people, the built environment, climate changing in relation to thermal comfort, discomfort? This is part of the project that relies on understanding the role of local and global building regulations, codes concerning health and air quality that dovetail with the increasing energy demand for cooling in urban Pakistan. So the Building Energy Code of Pakistan has been prepared by the National Energy Conservation Center, Planning and Development Division, Government of Pakistan. It was prepared in May 1990. And there is an entire chapter devoted to the building envelope that sets criteria to establish minimum energy conservation requirements for building. So on natural ventilation, it says there should be adequate ventilation when the wind does not come from the prevailing direction. To obtain adequate airflow and velocity inside the buildings, the position of the openings relative to wind direction and the position and size of openings in adjacent to opposite walls should be carefully designed, end quote. So acceptable practices for building ventilation are deemed to be or should be in accordance with the ASHRAI Handbook of Fundamentals. ASHRAI stands for those who are not familiar, the American Society of Heating, Refrigerating and Air Conditioning Engineers. The Ministry of Housing and Works Environment and the Urban Affairs Division refers to the ASHRAI standards for minimum performance standards, that this code gives minimum performance standards for building windows and openings, heating, ventilating and air conditioning equipment and lighting. And the Ministry of Housing and Works, Environment and Urban Affairs Division says that every effort has been made to ensure its applicability in our buildings, end quote. But minimum standards are applied only to centrally air-conditioned buildings. The increasing vista of malls, of luxury high-rises and corporate offices that are built using very different kinds of materials. But a wide spectrum of buildings are not on the radar. For example, the auto-constructed informal settlements, the kinds of low-income neighborhoods and buildings, precisely the sorts of spaces or modes of inhabitation in which people like Musa, Asma, and Huma find themselves. But thinking about the codes that rule cool air in circulation also forces me to consider what codes are being violated. So according to the Sindh Building Control Authority, from 2008 to 2014, a little over 1,300 buildings were officially completed out of 28,000 permit applications. But 18,000 buildings that were completed were done so without permits. And almost 6,000 buildings were demolished due to violations of building regulations. What are typical violations? Building on open recreational spaces, on green spaces, in flood zones, adding floors to a building without a permit, converting residential plot to commercial and vice versa without permit, illegal construction, especially in the inner city, which has led to increasingly higher density, more vertical construction, even in informal working class settlements. For the residential land use, the SBCA has banned construction of above ground plus 2 stories on residential plots over 120 square yards across Karachi. Nevertheless, ground plus 3 plus 4 continues to expand with more and more concrete in circulation, in the atmosphere, into the ground. So this led me down the pathway of trying to understand the role of ventilation cooling in informal and low-income settlements. I was trying to understand that what are working class households saying about cool airflows. So my colleagues and I conducted a pilot project in 2021, 19 preliminary household surveys where we interviewed 6 females and 12 males. And the location is Agra Taj Colony in Liari Town in District South, again, one of an old working class district neighborhood in Karachi, with acute shortages of electricity supply. Load shedding typically lasts for 9 to 10 hours per day throughout the year. Piped water is available only for 2 to 3 hours at night, 11 p.m. to 2 a.m. And household density is anywhere between 8 to 10 persons per household. Even though few respondents claim to have included ventilation as part of the initial design of their homes, they were conscious about the implications of wind direction and ventilation on the current layout of their houses. All respondents were aware of the orientation of homes on either east open or west open, and how this contributed to certain rooms being comparatively hotter, those located towards the eastern side, and others being relatively cooler throughout the day, those that face the side lane and exposed to a west-blowing breeze. A female respondent explained that the location of her house at the end of a lane, which was oriented along the southwest axis, made her house cool throughout the year, and a gathering spot for women in the area. For these women, the primary need was not cool roofs or even insulation, but rather more basic and mundane improvements to doors and windows to ensure that they could close properly. Here, climate change was largely irrelevant, and energy efficiency of secondary importance to just having access to services such as electricity and water. So to conclude, in my ongoing work, I'm trying to demonstrate that urban heat may be understood in 2 ways. First, as a personal embodied experience, and second, as a quantifiable or statistical thing, a relationship with the built environment and technology, and understanding this through the lens of infrastructures, of inhabitation, and by opening up the archive. And that by doing so, we might be able to add nuance to what is a very complex history of heating and cooling in relation to the urban context of a city like Karachi. Moreover, there doesn't appear to be one overarching story about how ordinary citizens navigate heat and seek cooling. But excess deaths also signal a slow onset of violence, differentially produced and differentially lived through being intimately tied to the social production of class, race, gender, and age, plus architecture and urban planning, the spatial aspect, tied also to social reproduction. Bodies lift and carry, become technologies of circulation, function as accumulation strategies, and enable social ecological fixes. In and through the uneven infrastructural work, bodies are differentiated. They also break down, overheating, thermoregulatory disruptions, metabolic disruptions perhaps. Urban heat then is a bodily and a material substance, and people experiment in Karachi and even in Jacobabad, experiment, learn, and cope based on their places and circumstances within their modes or infrastructures of inhabitation. But there is something to be said about how splintered inhabitations are being reworked also through newer circulations of cool airflows, through rulemaking. And here lies the possibility of taking a deeper look at the role of the state in this messy story of climate change and the city in the 21st century. Thank you. Stop right there.
We do have the ability to do some questions, and I think Christina has a mic. So does anyone want to start the ball rolling with some questions?
Thank you, Nausheen. That was fantastic. Really looking forward to reading more and learning more from you on this incredibly important topic. I had two questions. I guess one is what I really love about your work is the interdisciplinary nature of it. And also, like, as Tim said, you started out as an urban planner, but you're engaging with history, you're engaging with sort of quantitative surveys, you're looking at built environments. Of course, you work us through that a lot. You're also doing sort of ethnographic work. And I wondered if you could just tell us a bit about how and why you've chosen to mix these particular methods together and the challenges of that. And I guess the second question I really had was the gendered aspect of it, because something that you talked about a lot in this is not just the fact that women are sort of having to deal with so much more of like the impacts of thermal inequality and heat, but also like what I was really struck by in your interviews or in your talks was where they talked about anger and sort of this sort of embodied anger that they have, which is generated by heat. So I also wondered about how that fits into other gender relations which pre-exist or, which are not necessarily related to heat, but like structures of patriarchy and gender division of labor and how that is sort of intersecting with it.
Yeah, thank you, Nanika. So on the first methodology, there's freaking way too much going on. And I think it's also because, first of all, when you're trained as an urban planner and you end up doing a PhD, you are by default straddling many different disciplines, right? So there is that aspect of my training that I cannot get away from. So if I go down the route of doing just purely, I've never done pure quantitative work to begin with. So the quantitative aspect really comes in through my collaborative endeavors, because I do have colleagues at the KUL who take on a very, very strong quantitative lens. And that does get fed into my work in terms of the surveys. So I do believe I'm more of a qualitative working researcher. So I will do the qualitative in terms of ethnography, open-ended interviews, but I will take on the quantitative because I feel that it does supplement. It gives you that snapshot, which then the qualitative gives you the much deeper angle. So I like to mix the two. The archive, because I think really you can't work on heating and cooling without taking a dip into the archive, because I'm a very old fan of A.D. King's work on the bungalow, right? And that whole, the cool and the air and the disease, and I mean that's an old story within urban planning, right? The historical aspect has always been there. So when I started looking at extreme heat and cooling, by default I also realized that somewhere in here there is a colonial story here, and I think that now it's hanging it on this issue of anxiety, that that when cities like Karachi were made, and I mean it was by, in terms of its interventions, a colonial city, much like Mumbai, that in terms of climate, vis-a-vis climate, the anxieties were ever present. And the archive is full of these complaints about weather, about the hotness, the humidity, the wetness, and all of that. So I'm actually quite intrigued now, where has the anxiety shifted to, right? Has it shifted onto the middle class and the elite? And what are these different anxieties? How are these different? What do these different anxieties look like today, in terms of these different class permutations and these different types of? Maybe that part of that anxiety is also that female, in terms of the gendered aspect of it, right? In terms of lashing out, and absolutely, I mean, because women do also bear the burden of care work, and there is so much stuff going on in Huma's life. I mean. So the thermal diary was actually also in terms of shadowing her from her home to her place of work, and her work is in the home and it's in her workplace as well, and it's constant. And there is this constant anxiety also, right, which I think also permeates in terms of the experiences of heat. So I think I need to play a little bit more with this notion of anxiety from the colonial to the contemporary context. Maybe that in terms of a sub-question might also open up interesting ways of thinking about the effects of extreme heat and coping with cooling and the gendered lens especially. I hope that answers your question, but that's brilliant questions, both of them. Thank you so much.
Fantastic presentation. Thank you very much. With your presentation, basically, you realized the complexity of the problem. And here, with something we were working on extreme heat for a long time, and one of the main issues that we identify is how, from the academia, we can help. You mentioned in your presentation about how to update the future of the building codes in Pakistan, and this is something that I would like to ask you or to know more. How is that process going? Is working well? Or what type of connections can we do from the academia to try to help to mitigate this problem?
That's exactly what it's not doing very well. It's doing very, very well when you want to build your malls and you want to build your very fancy real estate projects. And it's doing very well on the HVAC factor. Because, I mean, I think so there is a very important story here to be had, right? And to be understood that even with the ASHRAI codes and regulations, the air conditioner rules, right? It rules. And there has been, I think, since the 1970s, in the global urban south, and I will speak for cities like Karachi, and I think we could speak for cities elsewhere also in the global urban south, there has been a shift in terms of the relationship between modes of inhabitation, the relationship with air conditioning systems, and how houses are being built today. So I think in Karachi and in urban Pakistan, generally speaking, most real estate developers would build with an AC in mind. So by default then, those are shy codes. Because we paid attention to those building codes and regulations. Well, yeah, absolutely, you did, because you built your barrier towns and you built your sexy defense housing real estate schemes, and along the Clifton Beach, those Dubai investments that gave you the high rises, those concrete structures in which, even the bathrooms have air conditioners. But that is really also, catering to a very select audience that consumes that kind of, of thing, whereas a very large proportion of the city's residents get left out of that. So how do you talk about ASHRAI codes in relation to auto-constructed homes and informal settlements and low-income settlements? They don't even come on the radar. Precisely this, and the dilapidated slums that people like, the bathroom attendant that I talked about live in Old Golimar, where there are slums, right? There are slums and there are informal settlements. We know there are differentiations, there are overlaps and so forth. So it's going very well for the real estate developers, but it's not going so well for, for others. And then in this part of rulemaking on codes and regulations, there are also these violations, major violations. So, which is really, I think, a more interesting story about the state itself, right? Who is the ultimate violator of everything, right? So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but that's kind of how I see it.
Yes, we will have time probably to talk more. Thank you very much.
That was really fantastic because of the depth of the work and the multiple methods used. I learned a lot. I think you hinted at what I wanted to ask in your answers. I was struck by if someone didn't know Karachi on the map, it's almost like the sea doesn't exist. It only comes up, when you mentioned Clifton very briefly. It's almost like in the sort of quest for modernity, colonial and post-colonial, the built environment is sort of the be-all, and that's why, the techno fixes that we're looking for today are also, techno-modernity rather than opening out to nature. And then you just now mentioned, the builders, and I was thinking about the cement industry, the, construction industry, and those are part of, this story of why the sea doesn't feature and air conditioners and high rises do. Yes. So I wondered if you can talk a bit about modernity and building and...
Yeah. No, oh God, the sand story, right? I mean, we could go on forever, right? So, I mean, I've written on that also, I've published on that also, right? That where is the sand coming from? And also reclamation. huge amounts of reclamation of the sea. So the Clifton Beach, in terms of what it was when it was part of that story in the archive, and what it is today, is something completely different, because there has been an intense amount of land reclamation over the last 20 to 30 years, backed by real estate, due to real estate projects that have also been backed by the Pakistan military. And at one stage, there was a fair amount of resistance in the 1980s and 90s, but it's all fallen apart for all intents and purposes. And then the wetness comes in a very big way, right? It comes in the sense that that reclamation has happened on very shaky ground. So when the monsoons come, or when unprecedented climate events take place, which happened in 2020, it happened briefly in 21, it happened in a very big way in 2022. So you have all these elite parts of the city that get flooded. And so this very shiny modernity of fancy bungalows and high-rises really does fall apart, because those are some very, very expensive pieces of real estate that are not insured, and that belong to very wealthy, rich people who are then fleeing to high ground. And this happened in 2022, and there was a great deal of conversation about and resistance coming actually precisely from those wealthy, households living along those areas, DHA and Clifton Beach, that the Cantonment Board, Clifton Cantonment Board, needs to be disciplined in terms of the kind of work that it does for risk mitigation, building better roads, that reclamation has to be done on more efficient grounds, so these sorts of things don't happen. But they do happen, and they happen again and again and again, because there's also something about engineering systems that's not quite fitting in, and the climate events are becoming faster and faster and faster, and the uncertainty of it is quite frightening. So the wetness story and the sand story is also where is the sand coming from? It's coming from the Kirtar mountain ranges, which are being blown apart essentially, and that sand is then filtering into the making of these homes. But not just elite homes, also informal settlements and working class settlements. So it's across the board in terms of what's propping up the city. I mean, it's like almost as if the city is eating itself up in many ways, right? It's very carnivorous, sort of swallowing up its own ecology that is, of course, very much produced through these kinds of actions. Not sure if that answers your question.
Maybe one last question.
Yeah. Thank you very much. It was really a great presentation. And I want to ask you about how it's fascinated by the ways in which you think your research provides insights into larger questions around social justice, around the right to the city, and particularly the sense of the embodiedness of cityness, of city life, and how in many ways certain bodies in the city just never truly belong, or there's always some discomfort around that. And really trying to ask, so can you tell us a little bit about how some of that work really intersects with what justice might mean in the city?
I would say thermal justice, not just social justice. I mean, there is also climate justice, but I think there is also thermal justice or injustice in terms of, I think feeling comfortable is really the ground zero of how we think about how our cities have been built, the carbon sink aspect. And if you have an air conditioner, perhaps you can negotiate your comfort today in achieving a certain level of privilege, where you can close your doors and your windows and sit in an air-conditioned room and kind of rethink the strategies of your life as you go forward and think about a certain kind of an urban future. And then there are, for a vast majority of citizens, where that is not possible. So Karachi is also a city of migrants, much like Jacobabad. So migration trajectories in Sindh have become quite intense. So this feeling of discomfort in terms of not belonging or belonging or sensing or being out of place, these sorts of things are becoming more and more dynamic, more complex, more deep-rooted, not just because of climate change-related issues, but also because what is happening in the Indus Delta. This is a long-standing story of the Indus Basin's degradation for colonial reasons, due to colonial interventions, and now also because of climate events. In the 2022 floods across Sindh, Sindh was hit the hardest for geographical reasons and for other technological reasons also. Cities like Jacobabad, which I haven't even talked about yet, were flooded with migrants. One could even call them internally displaced refugees, and for reasons that had to do with that particular climate event, but others. And on Jacobabad's periphery, you will see, what IPCC reports talks about the compounding and cascading effects. It's extreme heat hitting, meeting the ground zero flooding impacts, and where people are still living in half-broken homes, which have not been reconstructed, and the state's promise that never materialized. So in the story of Sindh, there's been a fair amount of celebration of how there have been interventions in rural regions, especially to rebuild homes, taking on more vernacular practices. But actually, the story that has not been on the radar at all is what's happening in the secondary cities and on their peripheries. And these are some of the sorts of things that I intend to get into much more deeply when we start looking at cities like Jacobabad, getting away from the big metropolis and looking at these other stories of social injustice and thermal injustice that are never talked about, which are actually quite horrific, quite awful. And so I mean, I could speak about all the amazing work that is taking place in cities across urban Sindh on climate action. There's the Pakistan Maholi Tahaffuz movement that is being led by Ahmed Shabbar, an absolutely amazing person, and his colleagues who are doing awesome work on-ground social movements. It's a Pakistan Maholi Tahaffuz is a social movement, and others also, and it's an amazing social movement because it really cuts across issues of intersectionality and class. So that is something to look at when we start thinking about issues of social justice. It brings in discourses of migration. It brings in migrants and refugees. And it's not straightforward. I don't want to romanticize it. It's a very, very pressing job and a very hard work. I'm not I'm not an activist. Tried to wear that hard hat once. I failed miserably. Will never even try again. But intense respect for people like Ahmed Shabbar and his colleagues who are doing absolutely amazing work on ground. So when I think of social injustice, I think of it along the lines of thermal injustice, because I think comfort is the ground zero of where we're at today. And I think that where it connects is really engineering, physiology, architecture, urban design. And urban design is, I think, the devil in the detail, and materialities and all of this. But then that just might meet me because I'm an urban planner. I'm biased in that sense. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you so much indeed. I think in my experience of these Sarfraz lectures, I've never had one that combines so much detail on actual people's lives with the linkage to some of the biggest issues we're facing today. And as you see in this audience, we've got people from many disciplines who are really interested in your work, and we look forward to hearing when your book is published. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for that warm welcome. Really appreciate it.